Welcome back, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something pretty ambitious based on the source material we've got. We're talking about a really big picture here, a kind of strategic puzzle that links things you might not normally connect. Stablecoins, US dollar power, specific political stuff, even major geopolitical shifts. And yeah, it even goes there, the idea of a cashless society potentially being, closer than we think.
It's definitely ambitious. The core argument in these sources, it's really provocative. They're essentially saying stablecoins aren't just some tech innovation that popped up. No, they frame them as a very deliberate strategic tool, a tool for the U.S. to keep and maybe even strengthen its grip on the global economy through the dollar. And what's really fascinating, I think, is this idea that it could even sidestep traditional financial powers, like specifically the Federal Reserve. It's definitely a perspective that goes way beyond just talking about crypto trends.
Okay, right. Let's try and unpack that a bit. Most of us, we get the basic idea of a stablecoin. One coin, $1, backed by real dollars somewhere. Simple enough, maybe. But how do these sources jump from that simple concept to something as huge as dollar hegemony and, global power dynamics? What's the mechanism? How do they say that actually works?
Right, and that's where it gets really interesting because they push us to look past just the convenience factor. The sources are pretty bold here. They state quite clearly that stablecoins are much more than just faster payments or, a new trading asset. They're presented really emphatically as a strategic instrument, an instrument for the U.S. to protect and actually boost its global dollar dominance. So the argument isn't really about making life easier for us when we buy coffee. It's presented as a calculated move by the U.S., a way to make the dollar even more embedded, more essential worldwide.
So it's less about a new kind of digital cash and more about a new tool for national financial strategy, potentially operating outside the usual central bank channels. That's a really significant claim, isn't it? But
Okay.
how do they argue this actually makes the dollar stronger? What's the connection they're drawing?
Well, the absolute foundation of this strategy, according to the sources, is something they call the dollar requirement.
Hmm.
Think of it less like just backing and more like a constant demand engine. The idea is for every single stablecoin, every digital dollar token created or even just bought anywhere in the world, an equivalent amount of actual U.S. dollars or dollar assets has to be held in reserve. It's not just theory. They present it as a direct, almost mechanical link. It creates this baseline demand for dollars that sort of bypasses typical market fluctuations.
Ah, okay. So this dollar requirement basically means every time someone uses or holds a stablecoin, it's like placing an indirect order for real US dollars, outside of the usual investment reasons. That's quite clever if it works like that. But what about the scale? Is this just a tiny bit of extra demand, or are they suggesting it's enough to, actually make a difference globally?
They argue it's definitely the latter. It leads to what they call automatic demand generation.
Mhm.
It's a mechanism that scales up directly as more people use stablecoins. So as stablecoin use grows anywhere in the world, the demand for actual U.S. dollars automatically climbs. Why? Because each new stablecoin needs real dollars backing it. It's presented as a direct link, almost like plumbing, not really dependent on economic cycles or interest rates in the usual way. The more these digital dollars catch on, the more real dollars get sucked into reserves. And critically, this isn't speculative demand, like people betting on the dollar's value. It's foundational. The system needs it to work. That creates this sort of persistent underlying global pull for the dollar.
Okay, and this automatic demand, this pull for dollars, that's where the sources say the U.S. government gets this big advantage, potentially letting it sidestep some of the usual rules set by its own central bank, the Fed. How does that actually translate into more freedom for the U.S. government financially?
Yeah, that's where the implications for U.S. fiscal policy get really interesting, according to this view. This growing dollar demand from stablecoins, it could give the U.S. government more freedom from the usual constraints of Fed interest rate policy. Normally, right, the U.S. government borrows by selling treasury bonds, and the interest it pays is heavily influenced by the Fed. If the Fed raises rates to fight inflation, borrowing gets more expensive for the government, which should, in theory, slow spending.
Right, because investors want higher returns, so the government has to pay more interest on its bonds. That acts as a kind of brake. But if stablecoins are creating this separate demand for dollars anyway.
Exactly. The sources argue that if there's this built-in growing global hunger for dollars just to run the stablecoin systems, the U.S. government might find itself in a pretty unique spot. This steady, non-speculative demand could mean the U.S. Treasury can borrow money potentially more cheaply, even if the Fed is doing things that would normally push borrowing costs up. I mean, if the whole world needs dollars for stablecoins, the U.S. government could, theoretically, issue debt more easily, maybe at better rates. Because the underlying demand for its currency is just so strong and constant, they describe it as a way of strengthening the dollar without directly touching it. It's subtle, but potentially very powerful. We're not talking about aggressive Fed hikes or currency wars here. Instead, it's about fostering this organic worldwide demand for the dollar, which then gives the government more financial room to maneuver, possibly with less political headache over borrowing costs. It's presented as this quiet structural reinforcement of the dollar's global position.
So this dollar requirement acts like a silent engine, constantly pulling in demand for dollars, potentially giving the U.S. government a surprising amount of financial flexibility, maybe even semi-independent of the Fed's usual controls.
Right.
That's a really bold assertion. But okay, if it's potentially that powerful domestically, what about internationally? How do the sources see this playing out on the world stage? Because it feels like this would have huge ripple effects, right?
Shifting financial power and national sovereignty.
Oh, absolutely. The predicted ripple effects are potentially massive, going way beyond just U.S. internal policy. The sources forecast that these dollar-backed stablecoins will become really, really attractive, especially for wealthy individuals, big companies, maybe even sovereign wealth funds in countries facing instability. Think about places with high inflation or capital controls or just unpredictable politics threatening their local currency's value. What do smart money and big players do there? They look for safety, right?
Yeah, traditionally they'd try to get their money into U.S. dollars somehow. Move it offshore, buy dollar assets, that kind of thing.
Precisely. And stablecoins, in this view, offer a digital, maybe easier, possibly more private way to do exactly that. It's driven by that basic desire to escape the devaluation of their own national money. So instead of complex banking hurdles, potential government scrutiny, or tricky foreign exchange rules to get physical dollars, they could just convert local currency into dollar stablecoins much more easily and quickly. It makes getting that dollar stability faster, maybe cheaper, and crucially, perhaps less visible to their own government's financial controls.
Okay, so if enough wealthy people or companies or even just regular folks in these countries start doing that, if they start using dollar stablecoins for savings, for transactions, what happens to their own national currencies? Do they just wither away?
That's exactly the dramatic outcome they project. As people and institutions increasingly shift to dollar-backed stablecoins, the actual power, the sovereignty of their own national currencies weakens. Monetary sovereignty, that's a government's basic ability to control its own money, manage its value, run its own economic policy. But think about it. If a big chunk of your country's economy and its wealth moves onto an external dollar-based digital platform, your central bank loses its grip, doesn't it? You can't really set interest rates effectively or control inflation or boost the economy in the usual ways if everyone's just using digital dollars instead. His policy tools become kind of ineffective.
It sounds like a sort of quiet hollowing out of national financial control from the inside. The government might still be printing its own currency, but if fewer and fewer people trust it or use it.
Yeah, what's the point? Exactly. And this trend, if it plays out as described, leads to a truly staggering projection in the sources. The potential for the entire world to eventually operate on a single dominant dollar-centric digital currency system. This isn't just about making international payments a bit smoother. It's pitched as a fundamental reshaping of global money, where the dollar, in stablecoin form, becomes the default global standard for almost everything. It paints a picture of, well, a kind of digital financial empire with the U.S. dollar firmly at the center.
Wow. A single global dollar-backed digital currency. That's a huge thought. A digital empire, like you said.
Yeah.
Okay, but if that's the direction, what happens to the traditional power brokers? Wall Street banks, big financial centers like London or Tokyo. Do they just fade away or do they adapt somehow?
Well, this is where the sources suggest a really significant potential shift in who holds the power. It challenges a lot of assumptions. They suggest that while big banks, Wall Street types, might seem involved initially, maybe issuing the coins, handling transactions, whatever, the ultimate financial power could actually move away from them over time. It's not like they disappear overnight, but their traditional choke points, their role as the essential middlemen controlling capital flow, that could erode, or at least be seriously reconfigured.
So if not the usual financial giants, who does gain the power in this scenario? Where does the influence shift to?
The sources are very specific and quite pointed on this. They explicitly claim this power could shift towards particular political groups. They actually mention former President Trump, the U.S. government itself and its key allies. So this isn't just an economic forecast, it's deeply political. It suggests a direct transfer of financial clout from corporations and traditional banks towards political actors and governments, and their closest international partners. It envisions a world where financial power is much more directly tied to state power and specific political goals, where economic leverage becomes a really explicit tool of national policy and political will.
That's a massive shift, suggesting a much more centralized, politically driven financial system, ironically using tech that often talks about decentralization. And they draw a historical parallel for this, right, to kind of contextualize how big a change this could be.
Absolutely. They compare it directly to the huge shift from the gold standard to the dollar standard. You know, for ages, gold was the anchor. Currencies were tied to it. Then, after World War II, Bretton Woods eventually made the US dollar the world's main reserve currency, kind of replacing gold's role. That totally changed global finance, how countries dealt with each other economically, where the power lay. The sources are saying essentially, get ready for something just as big, maybe bigger. That these digital coins, even though they're pegged to the dollar now, could eventually represent a whole new financial order, a new power structure. They argue these seemingly simple digital tokens are actually paving the way for a fundamental rewrite of global economic and political influence, potentially even more pervasive than Bretton Woods because it touches everyone's daily transactions. What's really striking here is how they frame it not just evolution, but a potential tectonic shift in global power. It's not just about how money moves, but who controls it. Who sets the rules? That really makes you think, doesn't it? What stands out to you about this idea of power moving from banks to political figures?
What really jumps out at me is, well, the sheer audacity of it, right? It's framed not just as a side effect of technology, but as a conscious strategy, almost a power grab by certain political elements. The idea that these digital coins, which look so neutral, so purely economic, could be tools to shift global financial control away from established banks and towards governments or specific political leaders. That paints a very different picture of the future of digital currency than, say, the libertarian dream some people have. It implies a potentially much more centralized, more politically managed financial world, even if it's using fancy new tech. It really sounds like a new, sophisticated kind of financial statecraft. And this grand vision, this ambition, it naturally leads into some pretty specific geopolitical forecasts too, doesn't it? Geopolitical realignments in the cashless society accelerated.
It does, yeah. Alongside this financial reshuffling, the sources get into some pretty interesting geopolitical predictions, especially for Asia. They outline a possible future where the influence of major powers there, like China and Japan, could actually diminish quite a bit. Not like an overnight collapse, but more of a gradual weakening of their financial clout as the world pivots more towards this dollar stablecoin system. The idea being that this new system might bypass their economic structures or just make their own monetary policies less effective. And since they're huge players now, any weakening naturally changes the regional balance of power.
And in that changing landscape, the sources point to a specific country potentially rising, aligning itself with this new U.S.-led digital dollar order.
Yes, exactly. In this scenario, they single out South Korea. They suggest it has the potential to become a key U.S. partner, maybe even reaching what they call a G2 level of influence. Now, G2 usually means the top two global economies, like the U.S. and China, so suggesting South Korea could reach that level implies a huge elevation in status, becoming a primary economic and strategic ally for the U.S. in this new digital financial age, perhaps balancing other regional powers. But it's important, the sources frame this as just one possibility, not a sure thing. It seems dependent on South Korea really embracing this digital dollar system and aligning strategically with the U.S. It ties right back into that idea of the dollar-centric system benefiting U.S. allies by integrating them more deeply.
So it's this really broad vision, finance changes, which directly reshapes international politics and influence. And then mixed into all this, there's also a very specific and kind of surprisingly soon timeline mentioned for a major societal shift too, right? It's not just about high finance. It affects everyday life.
That's right. They put a date on it, the year 2025. The sources flag 2025 as a potential critical point, a period marking a significant acceleration towards a cashless society. They don't just describe it as the ongoing trend we see now, it's presented more like a tipping point, a threshold where going digital only for money becomes the overwhelming norm, maybe even hard to avoid for many people. It suggests a real shift in how we handle money day to day.
And what's driving that acceleration towards cashless by 2025, according to them? Is it just stablecoins taking over or other things too?
Well, stablecoins would certainly be a huge part of it, yeah, providing that easy-to-use digital dollar. But The bigger driver they seem to point to is just human behavior adapting, combined with all the digital payment options converging. As people get more and more used to digital money, whether it's stablecoins, maybe CBDCs, or even just existing things like phone payments and online banking, the reasons to carry physical cash just start to fade away, psychologically and practically. I mean, if digital payments are instant, accepted everywhere, maybe even safer or offer rewards, why bother with physical bills for most things? The perceived need just evaporates.
Okay, but what are the potential downsides if we really hit that cashless point? It's not just about convenience, is it? What about things like privacy or people left behind or even, control?
Yeah, the sources touch on some really big implications there. Sure, cashless could be efficient, less cash-related crime, maybe easier taxes, faster transactions, but the flip side is pretty significant. Privacy is a big one. Every digital transaction leaves a footprint, right? So who sees that data? Governments, companies, hackers. It raises huge questions about surveillance and data use. Then there's inclusion. What about people without bank accounts? Or older people who aren't comfortable with tech? Or areas with bad internet? A quick shift could easily leave people behind, creating a kind of digital divide. And yes, control. In a totally digital system, could a government, in theory, block certain purchases, or create money that expires, or track everything you spend? The sources don't necessarily say this will happen, but they definitely highlight the potential for much greater state oversight, or even control over personal finances. It's not just a tech upgrade. It could fundamentally change the relationship between people, money, and the government.
So it's this whole interconnected picture. Stablecoins, driving dollar power, shifting global politics, potentially transferring power away from banks towards political actors, and speeding us towards a cashless society by maybe 2025 with all the baggage that carries. It's a really comprehensive and honestly slightly unsettling vision they lay out. It definitely makes you think about the speed of it all, doesn't it? If 2025 is the threshold, that's practically tomorrow.
Yeah, the focus on 2025 definitely suggests a sense of urgency, a feeling that things are moving fast. It implies the foundations for these shifts, the tech, the user habits are already being laid, and we're close to a point where it becomes much more obvious and maybe irreversible for most people. This isn't some sci-fi future. According to these sources, it's happening right now or very, very soon. It's kind of a wake-up call to pay closer attention to these developments in digital money, because they might be the small currents driving really massive changes in our world.
So as we've heard today, what we've unpacked really goes way beyond just a tech forecast. It's this huge interconnected scenario they paint, using stablecoins almost as the key lever. A lever to potentially reshape dollar hegemony, shake up the global financial order, trigger geopolitical shifts, and even push us rapidly into a cashless world.
It really presents it as a deliberate strategy, doesn't it? Not just things evolving randomly. It suggests there's a deeper game of power and influence being played out right through the systems we use for money every day.
And if even some of these predictions pan out, it would absolutely affect all of us, How you manage your own money, how you interact in society, even how countries deal with each other. Your personal finances, your privacy, the economy you live in, it could all be touched by these kinds of shifts.
Exactly. I think this deep dive really shows that developing digital currencies like stablecoins isn't just about convenience or tech novelty. This particular perspective highlights just how deeply tangled these things are with big geopolitical strategies, historical power dynamics, and maybe even the meaning of freedom itself. If you connect all these dots, it leaves you with a pretty big question to think about. If money itself becomes such a direct tool for projecting international power and potentially state control, what does individual financial freedom really mean then? And what happens to national sovereignty in this coming digital age? That's definitely something worth mulling over as we watch these changes unfold.